Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, so we're diving into this podcast episode all about Black Power and the long, hot summers.
The 60s, huh?
Yeah, think about it. America in the 1960s, cities on fire, riots everywhere.
Like the whole country was a tinderbox just waiting to explode.
Exactly. So today, we're trying to figure out why Black Power became such a force during this time.
And how it was different from what was going on with the civil rights movement.
Right, because it was definitely its own thing.
Absolutely. One thing that's crazy is we're not just talking about a couple of isolated incidents here.
Yeah.
Between 1964 and 68, over 200 cities had these massive riots.
Wow, over 200. That's a lot of unrest.
It was. And it wasn't just the number, it was the intensity, the scale of it all. It left a mark on America.
Like a scar, yeah.
You got it.
And it wasn't just numbers, right? These riots were intense.
For sure.
Take the Watts Riots in 65. 6 days of pure chaos.
34 people dead.
Over 1,000 injured. Millions in damages.
All because a traffic stop went sideways.
Which basically ignited a full-blown rebellion.
It became a symbol,
Of what?
of how volatile things were in a lot of black communities. And it wasn't the only one. Newark, Detroit, Oakland, Cleveland. They all went up in flames.
So this pattern, city after city boiling over, something big had to be brewing under the surface, right? What were the issues, the root causes of all this anger and frustration?
That's where the Kerner Commission comes in. President Johnson sets up this commission to investigate what was behind the riots.
Right.
Their report was a bombshell. It basically said America was splitting into two separate and unequal societies, one black, one white.
So even after the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, things were still that bad.
Oh, yeah. The report highlighted that legal equality on paper didn't erase centuries of racism and oppression. The reality was widespread poverty in black communities, terrible housing, awful schools, no jobs. And then on top of it all, you had the police brutality.
Wow. It's like all these injustices were simmering beneath the surface, and then, boom.
And it gets worse. The report also pointed out that there was no real will to actually fix these problems. A lot of white Americans just weren't interested in investing in the solutions the Kerner Commission recommended.
So you have this report spelling out the problems, and nobody does anything.
Pretty much. And that lack of response, that feeling of being ignored, that was a huge factor in the rise of Black Power.
Okay, so you have this simmering rage, and people are feeling disillusioned. But what was it about Black Power that spoke to people? How was it different from the civil rights movement?
Well, it was a lot more in your face, more confrontational. It challenged the idea that black people should just wait around for white America to give them their rights.
It was about demanding those rights.
Exactly. By any means necessary.
By any means necessary. That's a strong statement. So Black Power was rejecting the nonviolence of the civil rights movement.
Yeah, figures like Stokely Carmichael and groups like the Black Panthers, they were saying nonviolence wasn't enough. Not when you're facing constant oppression and police brutality.
Like they were saying, we've tried asking nicely, and it's gotten us nowhere.
You got it. And it wasn't just talk, either. Black Power groups took action, doing things to directly improve the lives of people in their communities.
What kinds of things?
They set up free breakfast programs for kids, organized medical clinics, offered legal help, started education initiatives.
Putting their ideas into action, actually making change happen.
Exactly. And another big thing with Black Power was this emphasis on self-determination and controlling their own communities.
So not relying on the white establishment?
Right. Black Power leaders were urging black communities to take charge of their own destinies, build their own institutions, find their own solutions.
Empowering themselves.
That's it. And that was a big shift from the integrationist ideals of the mainstream civil rights movement, which was often focused on fitting into white society.
Black Power was about embracing black identity.
Totally. Celebrating black culture, demanding respect for black contributions to America.
It must have been powerful for black people who had always been told their culture was inferior.
It was about pride, reclaiming their heritage, asserting their own identity. And it wasn't just about challenging white supremacy, it was challenging the very definition of being black in America.
Sounds like Black Power was a really complex movement with all sorts of different ideas and approaches.
It was, and that's what makes it so interesting to study. It wasn't one monolithic thing. It was constantly evolving, dynamic, encompassing a wide range of perspectives and strategies. To understand its impact, we really need to look closer at those different perspectives.
So let's do that. We've got the big picture, but let's focus in on some of the key players and their approaches to the problems facing Black communities. Where should we start?
Well, there were several paths being forged at the time. You had groups like the NAACP still fighting for integration and education, believing that equal access to good schools was the key to upward mobility.
They still saw integration as the best way to achieve equality.
They saw it as the way to level the playing field, make sure Black students had the same opportunities as white students. But then you have someone like A. Philip Randolph, who focused on unionization as the key to economic empowerment for Black workers.
So his focus was on economic justice through organized labor.
Exactly. And of course, you have Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who turned his attention to the Northern Ghettos with his Chicago Freedom Movement in 1966.
That was a big move.
It was, bringing the fight for civil rights to the heart of urban America, tackling issues like slum housing, police brutality, and job discrimination head-on.
Like the civil rights movement was evolving, expanding its scope, moving beyond legal equality to tackle those deeper systemic problems of economic and social injustice.
Absolutely right. King's campaign in Chicago exposed how much legal victories couldn't fix the deeply rooted poverty and segregation plaguing Black communities in the North. And it's important to remember, King faced resistance, not just from the white establishment, but also from some Black activists.
Really?
They felt his nonviolent approach wasn't going to work anymore, not in this new battleground.
Like the different parts of the civil rights movement were struggling to adapt to this new reality, this new phase of the fight. And then, of course, you have the Black Panthers, who took a much more radical approach.
Right, and that's where we really see how Black power diverged from the mainstream civil rights movement. But before we get into that, let's look closer at the specific challenges King faced in Chicago and how his campaign there kind of paved the way for the more militant tactics of Black power.
Okay, let's do it. Chicago sounds like a key moment in this story, where the old ways were being put to the test and new ideas were starting to emerge. Let's see what happened.
So King gets to Chicago in '66,
Mm.
ready to take on this deep segregation and poverty in the city's Black neighborhoods.
Yeah.
But he quickly figures out this isn't going to be like the South.
How so? What was different about Chicago?
Well, for one thing, the discrimination was sneakier, more hidden.
Mhm.
It wasn't just separate water fountains or segregated buses anymore. This was about housing policies that forced Black families into overcrowded slums, shady loans that kept them in debt.
And no decent jobs.
Exactly. It was all baked into the city itself.
Sounds like a whole other level of challenge for King.
It was. And this system, it was really hard to change.
How did that play out?
Well, King's usual tactics, the nonviolent marches, the demonstrations, they met some serious opposition. White residents, politicians, even some of the police.
So even the things that worked in the South to dismantle Jim Crow were hitting a wall in Chicago.
Yep, and this was a huge turning point for King and really for the whole civil rights movement.
In what way?
It became clear that getting legal equality wasn't enough.
Like winning a battle but losing the war.
Exactly. Laws were changing, but the real systems of oppression, they were still there.
So where do you go from there?
Well, that's where the frustration comes in, especially for the younger activists.
They were probably getting impatient.
They were. They saw the violence, the poverty, and they started questioning if King's nonviolent approach was even working anymore.
And that's where Black Power steps in, right? Offering a more aggressive, assertive alternative to King's way of thinking.
You got it.
Yeah.
People like Stokely Carmichael, who made the term Black Power popular, they argued that Black people needed to be in control.
Oh.
Their institutions, their communities, their own destinies.
They weren't asking anymore.
Nope. They rejected the idea of appealing to white America's conscience and said it was time for Black people to demand their rights by any means necessary.
That's a huge shift. So were they basically saying integration was off the table? Were they pushing for complete separatism and self-reliance?
It's a little more complicated than that. Remember, Black Power wasn't just one thing.
Right.
There were all sorts of different ideas within it. Some groups, like the Black Panthers, they did advocate for separatism and armed self-defense, seeing it as the only way to protect themselves from police brutality and violence from the state.
Like they're saying, if the system won't protect us, we'll protect ourselves.
Exactly.
Right.
But the Panthers weren't just about fighting back. They were also about building up their own communities.
Oh, right. The survival programs.
Exactly. They had free breakfast for children, medical clinics, legal aid, educational workshops. all kinds of stuff.
They were creating a parallel system.
They were providing for their own needs, empowering their own people.
Almost like a nation within a nation.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And that's why they appealed to so many in the Black community. The Panthers weren't just talking, they were doing. They were offering real solutions to the problems people faced every day.
So you have the spectrum within Black Power, from the militant self-defense of the Panthers to the community focus of the survival programs. But what about the cultural side of things? How did Black Power change the way Black people saw themselves and their place in America?
That's a great question. One of the most powerful things Black Power did was to impact Black consciousness and pride. It was about rejecting those negative stereotypes and embracing Black beauty, Black history, Black achievement.
It's interesting to think about the timing, right? This was a period when Black people were constantly told that everything about them was inferior.
Their hair, their skin, their culture.
Everything.
And Black Power turned all that upside down.
It was about saying, we are beautiful, we are strong, we are proud.
Absolutely. It was a powerful act of self-love and affirmation. Think about the Afro hairstyle, for example.
Yeah.
That became a symbol of Black pride, a rejection of Eurocentric beauty standards that had been around for centuries.
Reclaiming their own image, writing their own story.
Exactly. And that sense of pride went beyond looks. It was about celebrating Black writers, Black musicians, Black artists, Black thinkers, rediscovering and reclaiming a history that had been erased or distorted.
It was like a cultural renaissance.
You could say that. A flowering of Black creativity that we still see the impact of today.
For sure. Okay, so we've got the militancy, the community building, the cultural pride. What about the lasting impact of Black Power? What real changes did it bring?
Well, one of the biggest things was how it forced America to finally confront systemic racism.
They couldn't ignore it anymore?
Right. Black Power wouldn't let them.
Yeah.
It forced the nation to acknowledge racial inequality and the need for real change, not just surface-level stuff.
So changing hearts and minds, not just laws.
Exactly. Black Power shook white America out of its complacency and made them look at themselves. And that sparked a conversation about race and justice that continues to this day.
But did it actually change anything concrete? Did it improve the lives of Black people in a real measurable way?
Absolutely. The movement was key in pushing for things like affirmative action programs, which were aimed at addressing the disadvantages Black people faced in education and employment. It also led to more investment in Black communities, the creation of Black studies programs in universities, and more Black officials getting elected.
So real, tangible changes.
Yes. It wasn't just talk. It was about creating real change on the ground. But it's important to remember that the legacy of Black Power is complicated.
How so?
Not everything about it was positive. There were internal divisions, contradictions within the movement itself.
I guess that's true for any social movement. Nothing's ever that simple.
You got it. But even with its flaws, Black Power changed America. It challenged the way things were, pushed boundaries, and left a mark on our politics and culture that we still see today.
It's a legacy we're still trying to understand, all its different sides and meanings.
Absolutely. And I think one of the most important things we can learn from Black Power is the power of collective action, of standing up to oppression and making sure the voices of those who have been marginalized are heard.
Those are lessons that are still relevant today just as much as they were back then.
For sure. The fight for justice never ends, and we need to learn from those who came before us. Their struggles, their victories, their mistakes, they can all help us as we face the challenges of our own time.
So let's dig into these survival programs then. What were they all about? What kind of impact did they have?
Well, the Panthers, they knew that fighting for big change was important. But people needed help now, not later.
Right. People were struggling every day.
Exactly. The survival programs were about meeting those immediate needs, but they were also a way of pointing out that the government wasn't doing its job, you know?
So taking action, filling in where the system was failing.
Right. And they had a whole bunch of different programs, each one tackling a different issue. Probably the most famous one was the Free Breakfast for Children program.
I've heard of that one.
Every morning, Panther volunteers would be out there in community centers and churches, making sure kids got a good breakfast.
Kids who might have gone hungry otherwise.
Absolutely. It made a huge difference, not just for their health, but also for their ability to learn in school.
Makes sense. Hard to focus when you're hungry. It was about more than just food, though, right?
Oh, yeah. The Panthers knew education was crucial. So they set up these liberation schools, focusing on Black history, culture, and politics. They wanted young people to be able to think critically, to fight for their rights.
Give them the tools to change things.
Exactly. And there were other programs too. Free medical clinics with volunteer doctors and nurses, legal aid workshops, even help with clothing and transportation.
Wow. They were really covering all the bases.
They recognized that these basic needs were out of reach for a lot of people. They were trying to build a safety net, a community support system.
And they did all this with hardly any resources, right?
Yeah, they relied a lot on volunteers, donations, community support. It was a true grassroots movement. Pretty amazing how much they accomplished.
It is, but I imagine they got pushback too, right? The government probably wasn't thrilled about all this.
You're right. The FBI, under Hoover, saw the Panthers as a major threat.
Because
They thought the Panthers were too radical, too dangerous. Hoover launched all these programs to spy on them, infiltrate them, harass them.
all because they were trying to help their own community.
The government saw their message of self-determination, of Black empowerment, as a threat. The survival programs were like a direct challenge to their authority.
So even just trying to provide for themselves was seen as a subversive act.
Sadly, yeah. It's a reminder that those in power often resist anyone who challenges the way things are. The Panthers were under constant attack. Many of their leaders were arrested, imprisoned, even killed.
It's a tragic story, but also inspiring in a way. They never gave up.
It's complicated for sure. The Panthers were more than just a militant group. They really were dedicated to uplifting their community, fighting for social justice.
And these survival programs, they're a model for how change can come from within, from the people themselves.
Exactly. They remind us that we can take action even when things seem impossible. It's a powerful legacy.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, haven't we?
We have. From those early riots to the Black Panthers, from Stokely Carmichael to Dr. King, we've really gotten a sense of what the Black Power movement was all about.
It's been a journey, that's for sure. And it's not just history, right?
Not at all. Those echoes of Black Power, they're still with us today.
Those ideas of empowerment, of self-reliance, of fighting for justice.
It's an ongoing struggle, and we can all learn from those who came before us. Their struggles, their victories, their mistakes, they all have something to teach us.
Well said. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us, everyone. We hope it sparked some new ideas and inspired you to keep exploring this fascinating and crucial part of American history.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.